So first of all, thanks to the virtual seminar on economic theory crowd for inviting us. We're excited about this because we've just finished a first version of the paper and we'd love your feedback and discussion. And as was just said, this is interactions across multiple games. We're looking at cooperation, corruption, and organizational design, and trying to understand, in particular, when you look at how teams work, teams are often working on multiple different activities and tasks and faced with many different types of situations. So it's not just one game that they're playing. And this is true in jobs, in government, in research, and so forth. And we want to understand how that affects cooperation and how you want to structure organizations to encourage good cooperation, but bad cooperation. And the idea here is that there's some types of corruption. So for instance, if you think about police forces, there's what's known as a blue wall of silence, so that police people might help each other out in dangerous situations, but they might also help each other out in covering up corruption. And so there's this interaction between the different types of cooperation that are going on, and that's what we want to understand. And things, there are a number of organizational design tools that people can use. Like, do you keep your teams together? Do you encourage them to cooperate? Do you try and shuffle them around and discourage them from cooperating? Are you assigning them to some tasks and not other tasks? So we want to understand, for instance, why are teams kept together in militaries and police? Why are they randomized in diplomacy, retail, and services? And there's a very prescient quote from Jean Tirole in 1988, which I think sets the stage for this, which is, fighting the detrimental cooperation by keeping employees' relationships short might also kill the beneficial cooperation. It may be worth tolerating some minor acts of detrimental cooperation to allow trust between employees to develop. Viewing organizational design as defining the game played between organizations' members points to a number of interesting and unresolved questions. So that sort of sets the stage for what we're doing. And what we're going to look at is repeated game where there's a team going to be playing different tasks and situations they're going to be faced with. So they're faced with different situations and stage games that are going to arrive. Some of them are games where we want them to cooperate. We see things to be beneficial for society, and others where it's going to be detrimental. And we want to study the interplay and try to understand how this works. So think of a random arrival process, and the idea of cooperation might be, there's a police force. You're supposed to back up your partner in some dangerous situation. And the reason that you might be willing to do that is because your partner is going to, at some point in the future, back you up. And so you're anticipating the future benefits from this. But if that's happening too far in the future, this is very infrequent, you might not have the right incentives to actually behave. And so there could be things that happen more frequently. So for instance, maybe your partner looks the other way when you take a bribe. And the idea would be that now this provides you the incentive to actually perform well in this other task that the organization cares about. And so the idea here is that there's many different types of situations where you've got both good forms of cooperation and bad forms of cooperation. And here are just a few listings: police, patrolling, protecting. They could also be harassing and extorting. Military could be fighting and guarding. They could be doing atrocities, coups, pillaging, consulting. You could be researching and analyzing. You could also be false expensing, overbilling. There's a long list here, and it's pretty hard to find any situation where there aren't both types of cooperation going on among teams. And the basic idea here is going to be that the organization can't monitor everything that's happening. So you can't force people to act well in one situation and not in the other. And so you basically want to understand how can you mix things together in order to make sure that they're behaving according to the best possible norms from society's perspective. In terms of the literature, what we're really going to be looking at here then is sort of a stochastic game with a specific structure. So you've got a team, they're facing arriving games, and the arriving games could be sometimes good ones, sometimes bad ones. So this fits into a stochastic game structure. It also has elements of that you might have recall from the multi-market contact literature from the 80s and 90s, which was an IO literature that looked at incentives for companies to collude based on the fact that they might be interacting across multiple markets. So this idea that collusion in one setting can help in another setting is out there. What we're going to be looking at is really situations where it's good in some settings and bad in others, and we want to understand that interplay and what that means for organizational design. So there's other kinds of literature in the background. We'll also have something to say about corruption in organizations, which will be a different perspective on corruption than you usually see. So corruption is often seen more as a particular issue, and here we're going to see it as a holistic issue, which might in some cases be a necessary byproduct of getting a functioning organization. So in terms of contributions, the game theory, we're going to be looking at these interacting repeated games. Corruption, the kinds of questions we're going to be interested in when is it a necessary byproduct of cooperative production? When is it going to be that you're not going to be able to avoid it? Why are some organizations more corrupt than others? So what can we say in terms of comparative statics? How can you eliminate it? So are there ways to get rid of it altogether? And then in terms of design perspective, when should teams be kept together versus shuffled? When can they be specialized? So, should you split your police force into some of them that do the dangerous jobs and others just do the ticketing and traffic patrol? Which kinds of changes and payoffs can help? So can you give whistleblowing bonuses? What are the effects of whistleblowing bonuses? So for instance, if I try and eliminate all the corruption by offering whistleblowing benefits to say, look, anybody who reports corruption is going to get a reward, that could actually then undermine the corruption, but that also might undermine the cooperation among the teams and lead to the whole organization leading it to failing to be productive. So that's the kind of question that we're going to be looking at.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, it can also be that sometimes somebody who doesn't look the other way is the person that you think you can trust, right? So who doesn't take the bribe or whatever, so shows character. So I mean, I understand this is like
yes, yeah. So there's, I think the model that we're going to have is going to be fairly simple, and we're not going to have types where there could be some types who are duplicitous and have no integrity, and others who you can trust because they show character. So that kind of consideration is going to be absent. We're just going to have just a straight repeated game kind of setting where everybody gets the same payoffs, and then we're trying to understand that. But I think, more generally, there's lots of interesting questions when you start bringing in, maybe there's some honest types and some dishonest types, and how does that play into it? So I think that's a big can of worms that we haven't opened, but certainly something in, of practical consideration.
Actually, maybe just to mention one.
Thank you.
Yep.
You could also imagine that could interact with some of these shuffling issues. Like, when you see a police officer commit a crime, do you think that's a bad apple, or do you think the whole barrel is spoiled? That's sort of endogenous to your organizational structure in a potentially interesting way.
Yeah, certainly. So in our kind of thing where we're thinking about assigning teams and reassigning teams, we're not going to have to worry about contaminating by putting some dishonest type into some situation, which then might affect the people around them, which we've talked about a little bit and seems to be a very interesting direction to pursue, but it's still beyond what we are able to say in this particular paper so far. Great. So what we're going to do is start with the model. Then we're going to talk about what would be necessary to get good cooperation only, and we'll talk about shuffling teams. So when is it that you want to not keep the same team together, or at least reassign them periodically? Then we'll do some comparative statics and talk about bonuses, whistleblowing, rewards, those kinds of things, and see how can you try and improve cooperation that way. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about task assignment. So when is it better to split teams up and have some teams concentrate more on the dangerous tasks and others concentrate more on the potentially corrupt ones, and how would that work? Okay, so let's shoot into the model here. So we're going to have some number n greater than or equal to 2 agents playing games, and we're gonna keep it simple and have just 2 games. But you can think of 2 classes of games. There's good games and bad games, and those are going to arrive at random times. So you send your police out. Sometimes randomly, there's some dangerous crime that happens, and you want them to rush in as a team, take care of it, and back each other up. Sometimes there's other things that arise, which is there's a potential for them to take a bribe. That would be the bad game, and those things are going to happen randomly and with some frequency. And we'll just keep track of the F sub G will be the frequency of game G. There's a discount rate, and we can think of this just happening in continuous time. So the discount payoff at time t is just going to be e to the minus r tg. And then we're going to look at subgame perfect equilibria here. And the kind of basic example that you want to be thinking about behind the scenes here is just a simple prisoner's dilemma. So think of, cooperation is going to give some payoff to the players of C each. Defection will just normalize to have a payoff of 0. If you defect while the other person's cooperating, then you're going to get a bonus payoff. So you've got this deviation temptation D, and the other person's going to suffer for that. So we'll think of the cooperation payoff as the best payoff for the players. And here we're going to have, we're also going to put in a condition that says that A is greater than C plus D. So the total payoff from defection is worse than, if one player defects and the other person cooperates, is worse than just the Nash equilibrium of defection here. Okay, so simple prisoner's dilemma. Other kinds of examples you could keep in mind: favor exchange. So it could be that some days, my partner needs me to cover for them because they're have something personal to take care of. That's costly for me to do, but gives them a benefit, and the benefit for them is bigger than the cost. So you could think of favor exchanges. You could think of local public goods where, as in team production, we've got a team, we're producing some product. We'd all like to free ride, but if we all contribute, we get the highest production level. There could be commons problems, coordination of use of resources. So these games are all going to have the same structure where you have to build cooperation by some promise of future payoffs, and you need the repeated structure in order to maintain incentives. And the Nash equilibrium is going to be worse for the players than the cooperative equilibrium. Okay, so let's just go through the basic ideas here. Then, if we have a cooperation payoff of C sub G in some particular game, then we just look at the discounted stream of times at which they're going to get that in terms of expectations. Given the Poisson arrival process for that game, then you can keep track of what's the future expected benefit from that. And that's just going to depend on the frequency of arrival on average compared to the discount rate. And so you get a very simple formula for what a future cooperation would give you. And then cooperation would be sustainable just in a sort of grim trigger situation by having the deviation temptation being less than that future benefit from cooperation. Okay, so deviation temptation compared to cooperation, less than this relative frequency of arrival. So this is just the standard simple repeated game kind of constraint that's going to bind in these games. So in terms of a picture, it's useful then to put both of these games together. And now let's think of, these are the good games. We'll put them on the y-axis, the bad games on the x-axis. And then there's going to be some frequency of arrival of these kinds of things. So this would be a situation where there's a relatively higher frequency of arrival of the good games compared to the bad games. But you could also have a situation where most of the games that arrive are going to be bad games, and only occasionally you're going to get a good game. So there's different types of situations, and each organization might be facing different possibilities for where its teams are going to be placed in this figure. Okay, so that's sort of the background. Then if you think about when it is, if we were thinking about just one game at a time, so we just look at the trying to get cooperation on the bad activity alone, that would just have that the frequency of that game has to be high enough compared to the deviation temptation relative to the cooperation benefit. So you'd need to be in this region if you didn't have any interaction between these games. So if this was just one game played at a time, this is what you would have to have in order to make cooperation possible. And similarly, if you had the good activity, you have to be up here in order, it has to be high enough frequency of the good game in order to keep cooperation on the good game alone. Okay, so if you were thinking about the games without any interaction, so if the players were just thinking of these as compartmentalized, just let's think of the bad game, we'll treat that separately from the good game, then you would have cooperation on the bad activity possible here, on the good activity possible up here. So you get both up in this corner, and you get cooperation on each of them separately and these others, and then no cooperation would be down here. Okay, that would be if there wasn't any interaction between the games, but of course there can be, right? So what we can do is say, look, we're going to cooperate on both games or neither. So if anybody defects on either of these games, we're no longer going to cooperate. So the cooperation is sustainable on both if the maximum deviation payoff is less than or equal to the benefits from both games, both the bad and good ones, relative to the discount rate. So now what we're getting is a bigger bump in terms of adding in the future payoffs from both the bad and good. So we're going to cooperate in everything, and we just need to make sure that the maximum temptation to deviate in any particular game is less than or equal to the total future benefits. And so what that does is improve the payoff structure. So in terms of a picture, now cooperation on both looks like, look at the maximum of this deviation and compare that to the relative frequency, and cooperation on both is possible in this upper region here. So what happens is now there's a much bigger area, all of this area, instead of just getting cooperation on both when both constraints are met, now you've got a weaker set of constraints in order to get cooperation on both. And so you've got an improvement in terms of all these areas where you can get total cooperation. Okay.
Quick question about this, Matt, or sort of a remark, I guess. It seems like there's kind of two relatively distinct things here that are helping about pooling these different activities together, right? Like one is the asynchronicity, which is that if I cheat in one kind of relationship, I sort of immediately get punished on both. Right, so it's unlike in say like Burnham Winston, it's not like I can sort of simultaneously cheat you on both. So there's this kind of asynchronicity, and then also there's this potential asymmetry between the two kinds of relationships, right? Like maybe there's more slack in the IC constraint in one rather than the other, and they kind of pool together. So I guess model where you're thinking about these two activities being at different frequencies, it kind of makes sense to combine these. But I don't know. I thought maybe it was helpful to sort of point out that there do seem to be these kind of like two reasons sort of why pooling these things together is helping the relationship.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think as Alex is pointing out, and let me just go back a slide, and this is pretty important. By having these temptations arrive one at a time, then it's basically you only have to worry about one of these at a time, and you're not getting the benefit of both. So it's not like I'm in a shootout and getting a bribe at the same time and able to take both of those deviation payoffs. So I'm only thinking about one at a time, and that's what helps this constraint. Otherwise, we'd have the sum of these things, and then it would just we wouldn't get as much leverage out of this. So that's an important component, and that helps this kind of the whole possibilities of cooperation. And I think it's it's where a lot of the interesting aspects happen in terms of the design. So we're thinking, when we start talking about selectively assigning people to more of one task or more of another, it seems to be a really important aspect of the organization, which allows for these kinds of design issues. And I think it separates this out from what we would get otherwise. And I'm not sure I got the second part.
Well, the second one is that because the DB and DG could be different, or like the frequencies could be different, like even if games were simultaneous, you could still have a benefit from, in other words, if you're in a region where you cooperate in one activity but not the other, now you put them there even simultaneously, you could still potentially be able to cooperate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. And I guess what Alex is saying here is, for instance, this can be the situation we're in that first example where, maybe I want these policemen to cooperate in these dangerous situations, or military to back each other up, but they don't get into firefights very often. And so the reciprocation could be way, way, way into the future. But if the frequency of these bad games is really high, then that helps out in, so maybe the deviation payoff in the good one is the one that's really high and you have to worry about. But then the fact that you've got a very frequent ability to get favors on the bad side is what's going to help with the with this constraint. So the fact that you only have to do one at a time here, and these could be very different in terms of frequencies and payoffs, is what gives this real power, and why you could think of, okay, maybe the bad isn't so costly for society, but it's highly frequent enough that incentivizes people and can get them to work in situations where we really need them to work. And so all of these things are going to be the kinds of things that allow us for, to have some interesting things to say, I think, about the structure of the organizations. Yeah. Okay, so basically then things sort of break into two situations. And the critical thing is going to be, which is the binding deviation payoff, which is more tempting to deviate on. So for instance, in the police situation, it might be that it's a very dangerous, situations where I have to go and protect my partner. That's going to be life-threatening. You really have to incentivize me to do that. But to look the other way and taking a bribe, it's not that big a deal. So the deviation temptation is much bigger on the good task than the bad task. And what that does is mean that then it's this deviation payoff that matters. So you end up with a picture like this, where the regions are, look, you can get total cooperation on both activities. You could end up down here where you get cooperation on neither. And then there's another possibility that you could get cooperation only in the bad task. So depending on which of the two deviation payoffs is higher, this case, you get cooperation in the bad only. There's a region here where you get that. Whereas in the complementary situation, where you've got the deviation temptation and the bad payoff being bigger, then there's going to be some situations where you can incentivize good behavior. You've got high frequency of the good, and the temptation for payoff from the good one is lower than the bad one. So there's some possibility of getting good only. And so which of these is going to depend on, what the relative of temptations are on the good game versus the bad game. So basically, you think of it as the one that's harder to incentivize. Sometimes you're going to be able to separate that one out if you get things just right. But if the one that's has a lower deviation temptation, anytime you can motivate the one with the higher temptation payoff, you can also motivate the one with the lower temptation payoff. Okay, so that's just to get us used to these pictures. We're going to do a lot of pictures here in terms of explaining the structure of the equilibria. And then the kinds of questions we're going to be thinking about in terms of organizational design are going to be, okay, how frequently do we keep people together on the same team? Do we ever randomly reassign them? And what do we mean by random reassignment? Random reassignment is a situation where effectively what we're doing is taking some teams, and instead of saying, look, you're going to be with the same team forever, we're going to say, well, at some point in the future, we might randomly reassign you. You're going to get a new partner. And the more frequently we reassign you new partners, the less amount of time that you expect to be spending with the same team. And so that's sort of like moving this X towards the zero axis. Effectively, when's the next time you're going to be seeing the same situations with the same partner? That becomes less and less frequent if we're going to reassign you. So getting a new team randomly is like decreasing the frequency in terms of the way it operates on incentives. So that's one way in which you can begin to sort of control the incentives. Another way you can control incentives is maybe on average, people are doing half good games and half bad games, but now we're going to split teams into some teams we're going to put more into the dangerous situations, others more into the safe situations, say the bribery. So these people are just doing traffic tickets. They have lots of opportunities for bribes. This is the weapons team that has to go into dangerous situations. They're going to be mostly facing the more dangerous situations. And now we're going to have different incentives for different teams. And we might say, okay, look, these teams we're going to try and keep together because we want cooperation on the good task. These teams are doing mostly the bad task, so we're going to shuffle them and try and make sure that they don't have any incentives. And that's the kind of thing that we might do in assigning teams that's going to help us provide overall incentives to try and get good cooperation on the good game, but not on the bad game. And then the other thing we can do is we can also try and affect the payoffs. So just directly try and attack those payoffs to see what we can sustain as equilibria. Okay, so there can be multiple subgame equilibria. Obviously, we know from folk theorems, there's lots of equilibria. What we're going to do is look at the best equilibria from the player's perspective. So from the player's perspective, given the symmetries in the games we're looking at, we can order these equilibria nicely, and we're going to look at the ones which are optimal from the player's perspective. So what's the one that maximizes the total payoffs from the player's perspective? And what's going to be important is what's best for those players and what's best for society can differ. So if we think about the good game as having some benefit to net social impact, which is positive, and the bad game having some net social payoff, which is negative, then what we'd like is cooperation in the good game and not in the bad. What the players would like is they like cooperation in both games, right? So cooperation gives them positive payoff in both games, and it gives the social payoff as positive in the good games and negative in the bad games. And as a social planner, when would you like them to when is it that you'd be willing to tolerate cooperation in both games? You'd be willing to do that if the frequency times the social good from the good game is better than the relative frequency times the social harm that you're getting in the bad games. And so, there's going to be a social planner. You'd say, okay, when would you be willing to tolerate cooperation on both? If that's all you can do, that would be a condition, which is just going to depend on these social payoffs. Okay, so that's the basic description of the model, and now let's go through and analyze it. Are there any questions before we move on in terms of the basic structure? Okay, great. So let's talk about what it is that you need to get cooperation on the good only and the shuffling. So cooperation on good and not bad activities is going to be the best player equilibrium if and only if you've got three conditions holding. So the ability for us to say, look, we want our cooperation on the good one, and we're actually going to get it, and we're not going to get cooperation on the bad one, that's going to be pretty demanding. And why is it going to be demanding? Well, first of all, it has to be that the deviation payoff is lower on the good game than the bad game, right? Because if this isn't true, then anytime you incentivize the good game, you would also incentivize the bad game. So first of all, you're going to need to be able to distinguish between these two. And then secondly, if you want to get cooperation on the good game only, it's also going to have to be that the frequency on the good game is high enough to sustain cooperation on the good game, even if we're not getting any cooperation on the bad game. So we don't need the bad game to sustain it. So you've got to have a high enough absolute frequency of the good game in order to get this to work. And then the third condition is going to be that it's going to have to be possible to shuffle and still get enough of the good activity while not the bad. And so the relative frequency of the good game compared to the bad is going to have to be high enough that they're not going to be also incentivized to cooperate on the bad. And so that's the third, is sort of a relative payoff. So there's three different conditions. And if we go back to the figure, we can sort of see what those different conditions are. So first of all, it has to be that we're in this case where the good deviation temptation is less than the bad one. And so there is some region where you can get cooperation on good only, right? So we need to have that be a possibility. Then you need the cooperation on the good only to be possible. And so that means that, first of all, you need the X to be above this line. And then in addition, it's got to be far enough over here so that if you shuffle, you can actually get into this region. And so you need it to be in this region here. So the three conditions are, first of all, we're in this case, so there is a triangle here where you can get good only. Secondly, you've got a high enough frequency of the good activity happening that you can sustain it. And third, you've got a high enough relative frequency, so you're not also going to get cooperation on the bad and not be able to get into the good. So all three of those conditions are necessary. And I think what does that say? I mean, one thing to take away from this is that cooperation on, like when you've got teams together, getting them to be incentivized on good games and not bad games is pretty demanding. It's going to be hard, and you're not going to be able to do it if there's a lower temptation to deviate on the bad. So you need the lower temptation to be on the good. You have to have high enough both absolute and relative frequencies, and otherwise you're sort of stuck with it's like imagine the picture looks like this instead, where we're in the case where this is a dangerous activity. There's a really high deviation temptation on the good, so there's no way we're going to be able to incentivize the good only. Then we're basically in a situation where we can possibly get cooperation on everything, but if we're up here, we might want to tolerate corruption, right? So this would be a world where we've got a situation where we've got a relatively high frequency of the good game compared to the bad game. So we say, look, it's not that often that they're going to be corrupt. It keeps them working together. If we didn't have this, we wouldn't have enough ability to generate total cooperation. We'll actually allow it here. And so you tolerate corruption. Conversely, you could also have a situation where instead it's the bad task that is arriving relatively frequently. And you sort of say, look, we're not getting that much good activity out. We're in a region that's pretty bad from the social value perspective. So we've got relatively high frequency of the bad game, not much on the good game. So let's just give up. We're going to get rid of cooperation. So we're just going to shuffle our teams. And I think one way to think about this would be, think of this as like, put up here, say police, military, where, it's really important to get cooperation on the good activity. Those are the ones you really worry about, and you tolerate some corruption to deal with that. And then think of this as like perhaps, retail. You've got teams together working in a warehouse and so forth. They don't help each other out that much. So the team production isn't that much of an element, but they have lots of opportunities to steal from you. So if you keep the same teams together, they can become corrupt, and actually employee theft is the largest money loser for many retail chains. And so if you look at these warehouses and just retail sales outlets and so forth, they worry about that quite a bit, and they try and randomize who's together so you don't have a chance to form these cohesive teams that can begin to cheat you. And instead, you just shuffle them around, and you're not going to get any cooperation, but at least they don't cooperate in robbing from you. Okay, so unavoidable corruption. That's going to be this situation. If you've got the good activities more tempting, or the good activities not sufficiently frequent, then either you accept the corruption or you deal with ineffective teams. And important activities that are dangerous and infrequent, you may keep your teams together, and you might have to deal with some corruption in order to sustain things. And that's sort of this logic behind why you might see some organizations shuffling their teams to avoid any kind of cooperation, and others keeping them together and tolerating some forms of bad corruption.
And I wonder if there maybe also is some way to bring in something about like equilibrium selection or norms here in some way, like right, that story was predicated on picking the age and optimal equilibrium, but I guess like for the police, right, if you could have some code of honor that like we don't engage in bribery, that would be great. So I don't know, this is not the model, but like is that part of the story in some way?
Yeah. I think and I think as game theorists, we just besides shelling, we still have remarkably little to say about that. So I think it's probably of important practical interest, right? So in these situations where you think you'd like to separate out the good and the bad, and you really don't want to just give up and shuffle everybody, then if you can, if you really can create a culture inside your organization that says we're going to be completely honest, and you can drill that into people and make sure that they think some things are just abhorrent and they should never do them, and other things they should do, I think that then it works. And I think a good example of what you're talking about might be the medical industry, right? So you want doctors and nurses and people to cooperate on teams, and you couldn't prevent them from sort of covering up for each other. Like suppose the doctor malpractices or something, then you want that reported. You don't want doctors like systematically doing bad things. So you have them take this oath. You emphasize in your education training, you have to be honest. You have to treat the patient first. You have to, so you just kind of indoctrinate them to try to eliminate the bad activity. So I think you can think of examples like that. Unfortunately, I think in terms of game theory, we don't have a good tool for that kind of equilibrium selection at this point. But it's an interesting thing, and certainly organizations try and do that. But I don't know exactly how you could model it. So if you have any thoughts on like a good way of dealing with that kind of equilibrium selection, it's certainly, I think in practical considerations, it's important.
I guess one very cheap idea would be like you could picture that some organizations for some reason do get to select the best equilibrium for them, and other ones kind of don't, and you could ask how they would choose different structures.
Yeah. And I think companies worry a lot about this, right? Corporate culture becomes it's not a trivial thing. It's something they spend a huge amount of time on, and they do try and build that. Honesty is important, and we go through all kinds of training now on what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and so I think that it's another tool that could be used, definitely. One quick observation. So we've been talking about one good game and one bad game. If let's suppose we have sets of games, like good games and bad, so there's different activities that could be done. And some of them are beneficial. So you're a team together. You're supposed to be productive in lots of different tasks. But there's also lots of little things that you could do that are bad, covering for each other, or lying for each other, or stealing, etc. So there's many different of each of the activities. Then, if you wanted to make sure that the optimal equilibrium from the player's perspective is cooperation only on good ones and not ever on bad ones, you sort of need that you need to be able to separate the good ones from the bad ones, And so you need to sort of the minimum deviation temptation from the bad ones to be higher than the maximum temptation payoff from the good ones. And so that becomes less and less likely as you're going to see more and more different types of activities. So if you think about, an organization where there's some kind of, distribution of, possible payoffs that you're getting from deviation on the good tasks and on the bad tasks, then as more and more of these tasks are out there, the chance that you're going to have all of the good ones be separatable from the bad ones in terms of having lower temptation payoffs, that possibility is going to monotonically tend to zero. So that's just sort of an observation to say that one of the reasons you might see that organizations are sort of forced to deal with some corruption is it's going to be fairly unlikely that you're going to end up in a situation where it's all the good activities are easier to sustain than all the bad activities, and you can somehow optimally design your teams to give them incentives on one and while separating out and making sure they don't also want to cooperate on the bad ones. Okay. So next up, let's talk a little bit about comparative statics now. So we will talk about how you can think about changing payoffs. And so roughly what we've done is just characterize when these equilibria are sort of you have to decide all or nothing, or when you might possibly be able to separate out the good ones. If you can't, so imagine that you're sort of stuck with it's a police situation. These tasks are really dangerous, and the temptation to deviate and not backing up your partner is a lot more than the deviation temptation than to not back them up when they take a bribe. Then what you might want to do is just directly try and change the benefits and deviation temptations, right? So you want to go in, and what you can begin to do is say, look, we're not in a good situation. We're not able to get good cooperation and not bad. So let's try and affect the payoffs. And what kinds of things you could do? Well, you could try and say, decrease the danger. So if I make, patrolling safer, then maybe they don't have to worry as much. So if I give them bulletproof vests and I give them more backup and better weapons or whatever, then they feel safer in those situations. They're more likely to want to back up their partner. We make the temptation to deviate on the bad things higher. So we give them rewards if they report their partner for doing something bad. We change the benefits from overall cooperation. So maybe we just give them bonuses for total team production. We can't actually see exactly when they're producing and how they're doing it, but we could say, look, you had a great safety record this year. You handled all these things perfectly. We're going to give you all a bonus. So we could try and give them overall changes. This would be sort of changing the cooperation payoffs. This would be trying to change the good payoff deviation temptation. This would be trying to, right? So here we're trying to increase the temptation to deviate on the bad. Here we're trying to decrease the temptation to deviate on the good. And here we're trying to say maybe on the good payoff, increase the overall benefit from cooperation. So those are different things you could do. And recall, we need all three of these things in order to be able to isolate good payoffs from bad ones and good cooperation from bad cooperation. So we need the deviation temptation on the good to be lower than the bad. We need the frequency of the good to be high enough to sustain good cooperation. And we need the relative frequency of the good compared to the bad to be high enough to make sure that you're willing to cooperate on the good, but not the bad, if we shuffle you properly. So again, getting all three of these together, we could first just sort of ask, when is that possible? And the kinds of situations where that's not going to be possible are situations where there's more danger or other kinds of, maybe the cooperation benefits from the good one aren't very high compared to the bad one. And in particular, situations where you have low pay, low bonuses, low chances for cooperation. So if we think about why is it that relatively poor countries have high levels of corruption? You're not getting a lot of benefits from the good type of cooperation, and most of the benefits actually come from the bad type of cooperation. It's going to be very hard to incentivize teams to be not corrupt and only cooperating on good things. So the cooperation region's smaller, and then poor countries and organizations basically just tolerate more corruption or are relatively ineffective. And if you begin to see, okay, how could you try and change these payoffs? One thing, we've got these three different incentive constraints that we're, constraints that we're trying to satisfy at the same time. One thing that's interesting is, remember, we have these different levers to play. So let's suppose we ask the question, what would we like to do? What's our best way of intervening? Do we want to increase the bonuses for overall cooperation? Or do we want to increase the temptation to deviate on the bad task? Or do we want to decrease the deviation temptation on the good task, right? So which of these three levels, suppose we could have these three ones, which would we rather affect? And one point is the deviation payoff on the good thing, the good tasks or good activities or situations, they're entering all of these three equations. So if I hit that and I can make this thing relatively safe, I can help, I lower that, that makes this constraint easier to satisfy, that makes this constraint easier to satisfy, and that makes this constraint easier to satisfy. So all three constraints are being hit by that deviation temptation. I lower the deviation temptation, that hits on the good activity, that makes things unambiguously better in terms of all three constraints. In contrast, if you think about the bad one, it's not hitting all of these. So I could increase the bad one, that's going to help this constraint and help this constraint, but it doesn't affect my ability to sustain cooperation on the good task only. So for instance, if the good activity is relatively infrequent, then just offering whistleblower rewards and helping the temptation here isn't going to help me satisfy this constraint. So it's not symmetric in terms of hitting the bad deviation temptation, making that worse, isn't the same as making the good temptation to deviate lower, right? So moving those in opposite directions, they have different impacts. And also, I think there's another interesting difference between these things. If you think about influencing the cooperation payoff from the good, so like giving bonuses for total production, that's hitting in these two constraints, but not this constraint, right? So it's not affecting those relative deviation temptations. And that is sort of an interesting contrast in the way that these payoffs work compared to, like if you just look at one repeated game at a time. When we look at one repeated game at a time, all that matters is the relative deviation temptations to the relative cooperation payoffs. When we're looking at these, the deviation temptation is hitting one game at a time. The cooperation payoffs actually incentivize both games at the same time. So if I make it more beneficial to cooperate in one game, that actually incentivizes the other game. Whereas deviation temptations hit one game at a time. And so this is a different sort of situation from the usual repeated game where you actually, decreasing deviation temptations is more or less equivalent to increasing cooperation benefits. It's that ratio that you care about. Now you actually care differently because when we go back here, we're seeing that, the deviation temptations on the good, that's hitting all three of these constraints. The cooperation payoff is only hitting two of these constraints. They're actually having different incentive implications overall. Any questions on that? One point here then actually on combined policies. So let's think of a situation where you've got high temptation, low frequency good activities that you can't really make less tempting to deviate on. So let's think of, say, a military situation. You want to incentivize your troops It's infrequent that they're going to be faced with combat. So it's very infrequent that this is going to happen, but when it happens, there's going to be a high temptation for them not to perform. So you're sort of, and you can't really affect that much. So that's just a fact of the, so you're not able to hit the DG. What you can do is you could try and, affect, so I can't affect, if I go back here, I can't affect all of these constraints just through the, trying to affect the deviation temptations on the bad. But what I could do is through a combined policy where you hit the deviation temptations on the bad and you try and increase the cooperation payoffs on the good, that combined policy hits all three. So in some situations where I can't really affect the deviation temptations on the good game and its frequency directly, I could still try and offer whistleblower rewards, say, look, any kinds of atrocities and so forth, report those. We're going to give you extra bonuses for performing well as a unit. So we're going to give you high values for cooperation. Then that is something that can begin to isolate the good from the bad. And so what that suggests is in these kinds of situations, we have interacting games, combined policies can be uniquely able in some situations to get good kinds of behaviors out. Okay. Last part we're going to talk about is task assignments, and I guess it's a good time to stop and see still if there's any other comments or questions. Okay, great. So task assignments. So this is this other dimension where effectively what we're going to be doing is adjusting the activities that teams do. And what we can think of is that there's going to be some constraints. So there is some level of crime that has to be dealt with. There's some level of traffic tickets that need to be given out. So we still have to cover the same total amount of stuff, but instead of having teams all go out and deal with each of these activities, if we can specialize some of them to just doing the good ones and others to do the bad ones, then we can sort of separate out what the incentives are going to look like. And so there's a total time budget that a team is going to have to spend on average, which is whatever the arrival of or time that they would naturally be spending on good and bad. But the idea is that we could assign some team to some new frequency and put them, say, more on the good game and less on the bad, but then we're going to have to balance with some other team doing more of the other activity in order to keep the total amount of production or task assignments the same. So there's just a constraint here. And in terms of the picture, what it says is, okay, we start with some frequent relative frequencies of arrivals, and we're going to move some teams to say doing just the good games, other teams just doing to the bad games. The relative frequency that we're going to have is, TG over the total time will go of that teams go up here, and the rest will have to go down here. And so you just need a balancing condition. And so you're going to have, depending on the total frequencies and so forth, you might have to have more teams doing one than the other, but you have to, keep the relative constraints to be satisfied. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the full details of this, but let me just talk through some of the ideas here. So let's suppose that we're in a situation. I think this particular pictures will sort of give you an idea of how a lot of this works. So let's imagine we start out in a situation here where we can get total cooperation. So we can get the society to cooperate, or these teams to cooperate on both good and bad tasks. And we're not in a world where we could incentivize good only, right? So we can get bad only and so forth. What's the best we can do? Well, here we're sort of getting a mixture where they're cooperating on a fraction of good and bad. We'd like them to do more good and less of the bad tasks. So one thing we can do is sort of move some of these teams so that they're facing more of the good tasks and fewer of the bad. They're still able to cooperate. And then we're going to take the rest of the teams and move them all the way down here. And they're going to do just the bad tasks. But then these teams we're going to shuffle. So they're never going to be together. So they're not going to cooperate, right? So the traffic police, we just say, look, you're never going to see your same partner again. You're always going to be with a new partner. You're never going to have a chance to steal. But then the teams that do face the more dangerous tasks, we keep them together as units. But we've mixed them so that they're doing a relatively higher mix of the good task and lower mix of the bad tasks. So if you can assign tasks in relative things, you're going to try and push as far as you can to this constraint. So you go right up to this boundary where you can still sustain cooperation. So you're going to have to keep some bad tasks in there to keep them willing to work. But you don't, you try and get as little of the bad task as possible. The rest of them, you then shuffle those teams and eliminate the bad activity. So when you can assign tasks, there's going to be sort of an optimal way to do it. One thing we're just exploring now, and we are still working these results out, but there's some interesting aspects. So what we've done so far is have just this random Poisson arrival process of these games, right? So you're on good tasks, you're on bad tasks, they're arriving at some rate. But in fact, organizations can sometimes affect which of these you're facing over time. So for instance, think about a military unit. So what often happens with military units, you'd have a patrol, you keep them together, you put them in a dangerous situation, but then after that, you can say, okay, look, we're taking you out and we're flying you out and we're putting you back into a safe situation. Maybe we send you back to just doing supply things and cleaning and other kinds of stuff. So we're going to take you out of these situations. Once you've seen combat, then we take you immediately out. And so what you can do is say, look, we saw that the team just played this game G. We don't know exactly how they performed and so forth. We saw that they just played this. So now we're going to switch them immediately to the bad thing. So we'll just send them into a place. Maybe they could steal. Maybe they can do some other things. They're not behaving as well. But that could give them more incentives. So you can actually adjust the incentives over time by not just doing these things on average, but actually doing them explicitly where you're controlling which of the tasks teams are assigned to over time. And that can improve. So you have examples where you can show that you can get more cooperation and better cooperation out if you're doing this kind of reactive assignment than if you're just doing these average assignments. So it loosens an extra constraint and can give you some more wiggle room in terms of how you can incentivize things. And there's actually a second interesting thing which we're just exploring now. If you really want to provide incentives in these games, I sort of leave you with this intuition. I think it's a fun one. So if you think about a team and you say, let's suppose that we're going to keep you together for the next 6 months, you're going to be doing this particular task. What are your incentives on that? Well, your incentives for like at the first day, you've got 6 months of incentives coming from this task. The last day, you've got no more incentives coming from this task. Now you're going to be switching. So your incentives are not stationary, right? So you have different incentives at the beginning and at the end of this period. And so the constraint could be binding at one point and not binding at another. If instead I say, I'm not going to keep you together for 6 months, I'm going to randomly keep you together like a Poisson clock. So I'm just going to tick a Poisson clock that has an expected time of 6 months. And then at some random time, I'm going to ship you back. So you're just going to be in combat for some random time, and then you're going to get shifted back. Then that changes your incentives and keeps those incentives constant because you never know, you basically have a stationary future time period. So it turns out that using Poisson arrival times for switching when you're doing this reactive stuff provides much better incentives in some situations than you can do, using fixed time switching. So there's some interesting things that we're still exploring there. Okay, so we're at the hour. So, incentives interacting across activities, cooperation on good is relatively hard to achieve. Otherwise, you sort of either face some corruption or some productivity failures. You can adjust payoffs. Interestingly now with interacting games, the C's and the D's work very differently. So you get, situations where combined policies can work. specialization can work. There's design implications of the rarer arrival of these good activities, and the more dangerous they are, the more likely you are to try and have to keep teams together, but get corruption. So there's sort of like interesting implications for team structure, team organizations, when you can use these relative task assignments and so forth. So I think it's a great place to open this up for sort of discussion and get your further thoughts. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt. Alex, do you want to add something before I open it to everybody?
Actually, maybe just one comment actually inspired by one of the last couple of slides. So in an example like this, a combat one, where the deviation gain in the good activity is so high that you can't support always doing the good activity, even if you do also mix it with the bad activity. You could still actually sometimes support, sometimes doing the good activity, right? So even if so maybe you do the good activity every other time it comes up, or maybe you have a public randomizing device, you do it half the time it comes up. That could be something interesting to look at also, I guess. Yeah.
So you're saying if that there could be, so here we're looking at sort of total cooperation and none. Whether there's some correlating devices internally that could help, or public correlating devices that people could use. I think the hard part is that the deviation temptations still hit there, and you want sort of the maximum cooperation benefits. So we haven't found a way that we can work with that, but it's something we should think more about.
Yeah, no, I think it would work out if your like your continuation value from like the, okay, so it's like if your like present value from engaging in the good activity when you're called upon to do that favor today is negative. So like your continuation is positive, but your cost today is so big that like every time you're called upon to do the activity, the even knowing that you're going to get cooperative activity in the future, that's not enough to make you want to do it today. It's like if you only have to do this chore every half as often, you might be willing to do that, with all the incentives coming from the future rewards in the bad activity.
Yeah, or somehow reducing the amount of the deviation temptation today's. So you've got to somehow decrease that deviation temptation, I think. Yeah. It's tricky. I mean, we could also think of tasks where, you can cooperate halfway or something.
Well, yeah. I guess maybe the issue that the way you've modeled it is that when you're called upon to engage in this interaction, it's always a symmetric PD that you play once, right? If it was if it was really when the arrival happens, it's one person or the other who does the favor.
Yeah.
Then I think you would get this thing that you could ask me to do half of these costly favors, but not all of them.
Yeah. And
okay, Angel, you're the one with a raised hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I mean it's it's a very obvious question. I mean, given that the model is so tractable, have you considered the possibility of introducing asymmetries in teams? No, because all the changes in the organization are always related, keeping the team in, without varying the weights in the team. But given that asymmetries, we know that they affect incentives in cooperation. Okay, like they make it more difficult to sustain cooperation. It sounds like supervisors, should not be rewarded for the good outcomes, but actually should be punished for bad outcomes or something like that. No?
Yeah. So that's a good point. We've been treating these things. We've been looking at this kind of symmetric case because that simplifies the incentives a lot. But you're right. In a lot of teams, it might be that you have to worry about the supervisors doing the abusing or bad activity more than the team member. Some of the team members are more productive in terms of the good activities. Some are more productive in terms of the bad activities. And so you actually want asymmetric treatment of the individuals within the organization and within teams. And certainly, maybe it is that the supervisor has more possibilities of doing bad things, and so you want to incentivize the team members to do to whistleblow. But so I think asymmetries could be very fascinating and probably an important aspect of the design, because it's not as if we've treated it as if like all these team members are seeing the same arrival process of good and bad tasks and have similar payoffs. What you're saying is, yeah, I mean, it could be that even within any particular task they're doing, they could have different incentives. They could have different abilities to benefit from the cooperation, and that kind of asymmetry could be very important in structuring an organization. Sure. Yeah.
I mean, my concern was as a matter of design. I mean, starting from a situation in which everybody is symmetric, so it sounds as if your model can be easily encompassed, introducing asymmetries to help sustaining cooperation in the good outcomes and reduce cooperation in the bad games, not bad outcomes, but good and bad games. That was my point, rather than starting with an asymmetric situation.
Yeah. I know. I agree completely. Yeah, it's see if I can stop the sharing here. Yeah, so I think that's a good point. It's yeah, I mean, there's lots of directions we haven't explored at all, which I think would be fascinating in that.
Okay. Anybody else?
Hello. Can I ask?
Mehmet. Yes,
can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed the talk. So I have two questions. Maybe I missed one of them, but I was wondering, like, have you looked at what happens when the sum of asymmetric payoffs are larger than the kind of equilibrium payoffs? Because sometimes cooperation can be quite beneficial when alternating the play the asymmetric payoffs. So maybe you mentioned this, but I missed that. And my second question is, so is there any kind of difference from the insights that you get in indefinitely repeated version with the same stage payoffs, or not? Yeah. So that's one.
So let me answer the first one, and then I'll ask a question about the second one. So the first one is, yeah, I mean, so in situations where you can where some of the off diagonal payoffs are higher than the Nash equilibrium, that introduces additional equilibrium structures and ways of rewarding people in the future that change the analysis. We sort of just abstracted away from that because it sort of it complicates the structure of equilibria in a way that makes it hard for us to just kind of isolate things the way we did. And so the player optimal equilibrium could be a little trickier because you could be rewarding people. If they do cooperate, we can give you an extra reward by giving you the benefit of the off diagonal in the future and so forth. So you can treat people asymmetrically, and that I think it's interesting from a repeated game perspective, but it complicates this kind of analysis with multiple repeated games to a point where we're not quite sure what to say yet.
Okay, yeah. Especially, I think, like, if some of these payoffs are larger than cooperative payoffs, then there can be many equilibria.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't got a full handle on it, so for right now we've ruled it out. But it's certainly an interesting case. I think there's just a lot more. This kind of repeated game structure opens up additional equilibria that we haven't fully understood yet.
Okay. Anybody else? Because I have a question. I mean, more of an observation than a question, which is, it seems to me that there's an inherent asymmetry in the good and bad games, which is that when things go well, you're quite keen to advertise it. When things, you're playing a good equilibrium and so on. Bad things that you're doing, you're less keen to advertise, and so require some monitoring. So I wonder, I mean, I don't think this changes much in the model, but I wonder whether, in a way, this, do these things are different, right? These. So well, I'm sure you thought about it, so I'm let you gonna take it away and discuss.
Yeah, no, we haven't thought that much about it because we're sort of treating these things as both being unobservable, but to the extent that you can observe some of the games and not the other games, or you could monitor, that it's easy to see when they've performed well in the good game. Then that gives you extra possibilities of giving bonuses for those things and directly incentivizing that. And then you have to tolerate less of the corruption. I think generally you would sort of assume that, as you're pointing out, that the good game would be the one that's easier to see than the bad game, right? And so the bad game is generally going to be the one that's somehow, hidden and a little more difficult to see.
But in a way, I don't think you would need to change the model much, because in a way, more monitoring means fewer returns to shirking, if you want. Mm-hmm. So you could almost put it in the payoff structure directly without having to model it as such, right? That was my point.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we could think of these payoffs as sort of adjusted for being chances of being caught.
Yeah.
And sort of put that in directly. There might be some way of tricking a monitoring technology.
Yeah, but it might add an argument as to why doing one thing or another is the easier thing to do.
Yeah. That's a good suggestion.
Is there anybody else who has a question? Anybody in the
or if Lukas and Nicole want to add anything?
There was stuff going on in the chat. Kemal asked a few questions, but Lukas answered all the questions.
I can ask maybe something which is not like super well defined, but I put it in the chat. But kind of from the player's perspective, it seems like good to combine all the games in a way. But in reality, we kind of see that you don't want to, sometimes I was joking that, it's like you say, oh, this is business, not personal or whatever. So I wonder if there's kind of limits to this type of combining all the games against the players that you play. Sometimes I prefer not to perhaps add everything. So, but I don't know why that would be. I mean, I just was pondering. I don't know.
One comment I didn't make at the end, and this gets to what you're talking about, is organizations actually sometimes even put in artificial things that you do together, like team building exercises and extra things where you're going to spend time. Like, we're going to put you together and you're going to play games together, like literally, that have no productive value for the organization. But we want you to enjoy cooperating in those. And then the enjoyment that you get out of cooperating in those, and hanging out together and going to dinners together and doing all these other things, which is actually completely irrelevant from the organization's production perspective, actually then builds bonds which help sustain cooperation, say in situations where you do want them to cooperate. So I think that's another kind of interesting question of what's the scope of games that get put together and how does that happen? And I think organizations actually even trying to deliberately design, you always wonder why are we always doing all these team building things or trust building exercises or, extra meetings and dinners and social events. They help build those things, but then you don't want to put the bribery, ones together with those.
Okay, thank you. And can I commend Emre on doing this from a sofa? Somebody always does it from a sofa. I really appreciate the support here. Thank you. I think we're